All right. Hey, everybody, let's get started. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Emily, and I am the chapter leader of the Charlottesville chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby. I know a lot of you are already familiar with Citizens Climate Lobby, but for those who aren't, we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that advocates for federal level climate policy, specifically a price on carbon pollution. We're nationwide and active in over 90% of congressional districts. One of the things that we do to build political will and to advocate for a livable future is to educate people about climate change. So that's what we're doing here tonight, and we are so grateful to all of you who have joined us. Late summer is known among volunteer organizations to be one of the most difficult times of the year to get people engaged, so thank you especially to everyone who made time to be here this evening. Before we begin, I want to say thank you to our panelists. Professor Deborah Lawrence is here from the University of Virginia School of Environmental Thought and Practice. She really helped us to get this event off of the ground, so we are extra grateful to Dr. Lawrence. Ann Coates is the Executive Director of the Thomas Jefferson Soil and Water Conservation District. And last but not least, we are joined by Dr. Robin Cooper, who is a longtime CCL volunteer and founder of the Climate Psychiatry Alliance. We are so grateful to all of these women for being here tonight and sharing their expertise with us. I also want to thank our moderator, Dr. Robert Kitchen. Bob is a retired physician, a member of CCL's Health Action Lobby team, and a member of Virginia Clinicians for Climate Action. We are very grateful to Bob for taking on the role as moderator, and he has been instrumental in the planning of tonight's event. Also deserving gratitude is John Clark, the Appalachian Regional Coordinator for Citizens Climate Lobby. John gave us endless behind the scenes and tech support for tonight's event, and he supports our chapter in large and small ways all the time. I'm also grateful to our state coordinators, Chris Wiegard and Stephanie Burns. And finally, I want to thank Nan Halperin, Ellie Severud, and Joan Chapman from CCL Charlottesville. These ladies conceived of, planned, and executed tonight's event with very little help or support from me or the chapter. I am inspired by their willingness to work hard and get out of their comfort zones, and I am grateful to be beside them working for a better future. Now I'm going to turn it over to Bob.
There we go. Emily, thank you very much for that introduction. I wanted to express our appreciation to the Charlottesville chapter of CCL for arranging this presentation and panel discussion to talk about extreme heat and its impact on Virginia. As the flyer announcing today's event stated, heat is the most devastating aspect of the climate crisis our planet faces, and extreme heat has a serious impact on health, both physical and mental, environmental justice, agriculture, and the planet, along with other aspects of human existence. To set the stage for today's discussion, I wanted to report on just a few of the recent announcements and news articles highlighting this problem. The recent release by the United Nations of the 6th version of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's report had the UN Secretary General describing it as quote, a code red for humanity. The alarm bells are deafening and the evidence is irrefutable, end quote. The report stated global surface temperature has increased faster since 1970 than any other 50-year period over at least the last 2,000 years. 2 weeks ago, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration announced that July was Earth's hottest month on record. And we witnessed unprecedented heat waves impacting the Northwest, with the New York Times reporting that over 600 may have died in the Oregon heat wave. And now, focusing on Virginia, the Virginia Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine released a report of the impact of climate change on coastal Virginia and stated that more frequent heat waves could lead to 170 excess deaths annually by the 2040s, and that public health will be threatened by recurrent flooding, saltwater intrusion into drinking water, and inundation of septic systems. The Union of Concerned Scientists released a report 2 weeks ago titled "Too Hot to Work," which stated exposure to extreme heat was the top cause of weather-related deaths in the United States, with more than 600 heat-related deaths yearly from 1999 to 2010. This same report provided an interactive map such that any county in the United States could be selected to see what can be expected if warming continues at the current rate throughout this century. This and the next 2 slides highlight the impact in Virginia by focusing on Chesapeake County and southeastern Virginia. Historically, this county has had 3 at-risk workdays a year. At-risk is defined by the CDC as a combination of temperature and humidity exceeding 100 degrees. By mid-century, if no action is taken to counter rising temperatures, the number of at-risk days increases to 17, and by late century, the number will be 33 days a year. We also have had the situation where increasing temperatures have led to a greater number of cases of Lyme disease with a northward migration of the ticks to warmer environments. This warmer weather also causes a larger number of bacteria in the tick, leading to a greater chance of developing the disease if bitten. This map shows the national trend over a 20-year period, and this map focuses on Virginia, showing that in 1996, Lyme disease ticks were reported in 12 of our 95 counties, with 357 cases of Lyme disease reported. By 2016, ticks were reported in 72 of the 95 counties, and over 1,200 cases were reported. So yes, it is getting hotter and the health of Virginians is being impacted. We have a stellar panel today to help us better understand the impact of extreme heat on Virginia. But before starting with our presentations, I wanted to go ahead and explain how the question process would work. First, there are a few questions that were received by email during the registration process, and these will be asked of the panelists. We will then go to the questions that you submit today. And the process for this will be to use the chat button and then select the participant identified as Ask Me to send your question. And Chris Weigard, who is the state coordinator for CCL, has volunteered to do this. So you won't be looking for Chris's name per se. You'll see Ask Me with Chris behind it. If you have a particular panelist in mind when submitting your question, do indicate this in your text message. So I'm happy to introduce our next speaker, our first speaker, and this is Dr. Deborah Lawrence, who's Professor of Environmental Sciences and Director of the Program of Environmental Thought and Practice at UVA. Dr. Lawrence studies the interactions between tropical deforestation and climate change, has worked with several partner organizations to understand the impacts of global land use decisions on climate. Her research has earned her numerous awards, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Jefferson Science Fellowship from the National Academy of Sciences, and a Fulbright Scholarship. And her favorite extracurricular activity is Write Climate, a project using art to communicate science, engage the public, and build a community around climate action. Deborah, appreciate you having you here today. Take it away.
Thanks, Bob. I think you have to stop sharing.
Okay.
Thanks for that kind introduction. I'm really happy to be here. I really appreciate the fact that all of you have tuned in to think about global warming and to think about what that really means, because it's hard to get your hands around global warming. So today we're talking about heat, which is something that is specific. And I wanted to start out by just saying, if we were talking about humans, you would all know what a fever looks like, right? So that little emoji on the top is someone who is just hot for a while. That is not a fever, right? The little emoji on the bottom is someone who is clearly ailing. That person is experiencing systemic, persistent, and damaging heat. So there's a difference, right, between hot weather, having a hot spell, and having a fever. So for the planet, what does that look like? For the planet, what we're talking about is the difference between having periodic warm spells and having, again, systemic, persistent, and damaging heat. What does that mean for the planet? It means the entire planet. It means night and day, and it means winter and summer. always warm, always hot. So I'm showing you two images, the one on the top, mostly blue, from the 1890s. This is an image, the blues indicate that we are below average or below the reference period. And in this case, the reference period is the middle of the last century. So at this time period, most of the Earth was relatively cool, except you can see that one warm spot. And I'm saying we're going to have warm spots on the planet, like that periodic heat, like a hot day when that little emoji is sweating over here. But the bottom panel from 2020 is quite a different picture, right? It's all orange and red, except for a few spots. So the warming is persistent, it's across the globe, and it's all hot, some of it really hot. So this is the fever we're talking about for the planet. Oops, sorry. The thing is, when you think about heat or global warming, global is confusing. Average warming, we talk always about increases in average temperature for place to place. So all of these places have had an increase in average temperature, but we don't actually experience an average temperature. So even if our town, our state, our nation, and our globe is having a fever and experiencing a fever, we might not actually feel it. But we do know about extreme heat. We all know what it feels like to have a very, very hot day. So sometimes thinking about extremes helps us understand global warming. So first of all, I want to get us on the same page. What is extreme heat? So you might think, oh my gosh, math, but I drew this by hand so you wouldn't be freaked out. So if you're thinking about how you can understand extreme heat, think about the chance of any day on a given day of a given year. What's the chance it's going to have a certain temperature? Mostly they're going to fall in the middle, right here on the average. Most of the time, the temperature will be average. Then there's a bunch that are below average and a bunch that are above average. Scientists think about the top 5% of those days, the hottest of the hot days, as being extreme heat. So there it is, and it falls above some critical threshold. Above that, that's the top 5%. So that's how scientists think about extreme heat. Well, how does warming affect extreme heat? What I've shown you here is I just shifted that distribution, that graph of all the different chances of getting a certain temperature. I shifted it to the right, to warming. What that does is it means that original level above which we had 5% of the days were super hot, suddenly we have a lot more days falling in that range. So we have, instead of just 5% falling above this critical threshold, this red line here, we have maybe 10%, maybe more. So extreme heat, we feel it, we know it, it can be damaging. And as the planet warms, as the average goes up, the extreme heat goes up as well. So that gets me to the thing about the way we think about climate change. We think climate change is something like this: increase the temperature from 1 to 2 to 3 degrees Celsius, or 1.8 Fahrenheit to 5.4 Fahrenheit. That's at the global scale. And you get some increase in the number of deadly heat days, right? That's kind of how a normal person might think the climate change works. But it doesn't work that way. In actuality, a small increase in average temperature leads to a dramatic increase in extreme heat. It's just the way that those graphs work. So why do we care so much about extreme heat? What are the questions we ask as scientists? Well, we want to know how much hotter. Does it push us beyond some level at which we can no longer tolerate the heat? What about the duration of heat events? Are they longer? How many times a year does this happen? And how will people and the ecosystems on which we depend, how will we cope? So extreme heat is extremely important. And the answer to all these questions tends to be, it's not going to get better for sure. I think we're looking at more frequent high temperatures, higher high temperatures. The duration, we don't know about that yet, but we do know that they're more likely to be more frequent events. And we're also pretty sure that people will struggle to adapt. So what does this mean in Virginia? Bob already showed us several really interesting pieces of data. I'm going to show you two ways of thinking about what warming means for heat in Virginia. And the first point I'm going to make is that Virginia will feel like another state. It's not going to feel like Virginia. So this is from Stephen Nash's Climate Fever, and it shows two scenarios. One is work and hope, like work hard, maybe we get something done and we don't see the worst warming. That's the orange one. The red one is business as usual. We don't get it done in time. And what you can see is that in this work and hope scenario, Virginia looks more like North Carolina or South Carolina by the end of the century. That's the good scenario. The bad scenario, business as usual, Virginia looks like Northern Florida or Southern Georgia. There's nothing wrong with those states, right? People survive there. It's just very different. That's not what Virginia is used to. That will take some adapting. The other way to think about what warming means for Virginia is that summer will be unrecognizable. And this alludes to what Bob talked about in terms of the number of days that are just very, very hot. This is not extremely hot days. This is simply a graph of the number of days over 90 degrees. The top panel is the historic. The second panel is 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit of rise, or 1 degree Celsius. The bottom third one is 2 degrees Celsius warming, and the bottom panel is 3 degrees Celsius warming. And what we're looking at is how many days are over 90 in Charlottesville. And what you can see is that historically we had about 30 to 35 days. We are already at a place where we have 46 to 50. We've changed it by 50%. This work and hope scenario, we're going to double it, double the number of days that are over 90. And in that worst case scenario, it's worse still. We could have 80 or 90 days of the summer over 90 degrees. So you might think, well, 90's not terrible. 90's pretty hot. It's really a different kind of summer when it's that hot. And most importantly, some of those summer days will be deadly. So this is probably, maybe it's the same data set that the Union of Concerned Scientists used that Bob showed us. This is a data set that shows the number of deadly heat days. And again, the work and hope scenario is on the top and the business as usual scenario is on the bottom. And this is just change that we can anticipate in 2050. That's not so far away. So Virginia up here, the way you read the graph is if it were red, it would mean that every single day of the year is deadly. Now, we don't have that scenario by 2050 in most of the US. We do see that in several places in the tropics. So there are parts of the world that are already red by 2050. And certainly in that business as usual scenario. For us, if you look up here, you can sort of see where Virginia is. It's got, it's doing okay in 2050 if we do our best. But if we don't, it's starting to, all these warm yellows, that is saying that's down here somewhere like maybe 70, 80, 90, who knows how many days will be deadly. There's a lot of possibility for extremely high temperatures if we don't act soon. So I just am trying to set the stage for the rest of my colleagues, because all I can tell you as someone who works with climate data is that we can predict the number of days at a certain temperature, but it takes a lot more than that alone to understand the impact of extreme heat. And I'm hoping that some of my fellow panelists can shed some light on that.
Deborah, thank you very much. That was excellent. And you really did help us understand what's transpiring here. I'll go ahead and introduce Dr. Robin Cooper, who will be speaking next. And Robin, you can go ahead and see about sharing your screen. Or John, you're going to get her slides up. So Dr. Robin Cooper has been in private practice with a focus on both psychotherapy and medical management. And she has a clinical appointment of associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of California, San Francisco. Robin's interest in issues of the climate change impacts on the mentally ill derives from her many years of political work on climate change politics, specifically working with Citizens Climate Lobby. Her concern for environmental justice has fueled her interest in understanding the differential impacts of climate disruption on poor, underserved communities, including the mentally ill. She is a distinguished life fellow of the American Psychiatric Association. Robin, looking forward to your talk.
Well, thank you very much for having me here. I'm delighted to be here. As Bob said, I'm a member of Citizens Climate Lobby, have been for a very long time. And I also am the co-founder of Climate Psychiatry Alliance. So I'm going to be talking about the interface of those two. But before we get started, I just want to give a shout out to my old roommate before I went to medical school, Nan Halpern, for inviting me here, and so delighted that we're doing a project together since when we were very young. I want to remind you of the International Governmental Panel's Climate Change Report. But before I do that, today we can't just go on and speak without talking specifically about what's just woken us up again in New Orleans and Louisiana. And I believe that you in Virginia are waiting for the tail end of Hurricane Ida. Another just really important reminder of this stuff is big and happening now. And in my own state of California, we're very troubled by the extensive wildfires. Now, Bob has already talked about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which just came out in August. And the scientists used words like unprecedented, unequivocal, and that were baked in for temperature rises. Bob talked about them calling this a code red on humanity. Scientists don't talk with those kinds of words. And it's important then to know that they are alarmed, but they've also given us the clue to what we can do by reducing emissions. I want us to specifically talk about, and Deborah, you gave a wonderful foundation of talking about extreme heat, deadly days of heat. And I just want to give a little bit of background about how we humans manage extreme heat. Now, we live within a narrow range of heat tolerance, and our body's deadly heat occurs when our core temperature is at about 106 or 107. Now, we do have the ability to acclimate to changes in heat, but that takes about 2 to 6 weeks. So when I come to the East Coast from the West, where I live in a very cool climate, I'm shocked that people are able to manage at the temperatures that you on the East and in Virginia live through. It takes me longer to acclimate. There are other things also about how we maintain our internal core temperature. Sweating is the most effective way that we release heat in our bodies. But heat is not the only story. Humidity, the amount of moisture in the air, is also incredibly important. And the higher amount of moisture, the least effective we are at cooling, because the evaporative processes don't work as well. So humidity also is of great concern for maintaining core body temperature. Now, I'm going to speak specifically today about the mental health and community mental health aspects of climate change. But I wanted to show you a bit about how profound the experiences are in heat, on climate change, on physical and mental illness. Now, extreme heat has a major impact on mental health. And I'm going to run through these pretty quickly today, but I want you to know that it's more than just feeling bad about what's happening in the world. We all feel pretty cranky when it's hot outside, and our colloquial language tells us that. I'm so angry, my blood is boiling. He's so hot-headed, or that admonition, chill out, be cool, man, when someone's really angry. But scientific evidence shows us that actually it's more than crankiness. Aggression increases during extreme heat, from kids on the baseball field who are getting into scrapes to domestic disputes turning really nasty. And that does concern me about children and women who are vulnerable to domestic abuse. There is more violence and more aggression interpersonally and group violence. And there are more violent crimes during periods of extreme heat. And this is due to heat alone. That's also true of suicide, which I consider to be a kind of aggression turned against the self. This is an elegant study where the researcher attempted to extract and only look at the heat extreme temperature increases on suicide. And what he found was significant increases due to heat alone for suicide. And he projected that by 2050, if we do nothing to change the curve, that there will be 21,000 more suicides due to heat alone. This wipes out all of the impacts of suicide prevention programs or gun control. Extreme heat also makes us more depressed, and there's an increase in psychiatric illnesses that are related to mood. Thinking is impaired during extreme heat periods, and most of us don't take on challenging tasks and complex thinking. But we also know that learning is impaired, working memory, and other aspects of cognition. And sleep. It is really difficult to sleep during extreme heats, and particularly as we go into having hot times in the night. We need the body to decrease its temperature to sustain heat. And insomnia impacts almost all of our behavioral, cognitive, and mood functions. Now, medications are an important thing to think about during extreme heat, because our ability to maintain our lowered body temperature is affected by many medications that we use. And that's particularly true in my field of psychiatry. But there are also other medications that make it more difficult to maintain body's temperature. And those can be medications for blood pressure, laxatives, migraine, or allergy medications, and some others. Now, heat does not stand alone. Heat also drives secondary impacts, and hot temperatures have an impact on changing pollutants, nitrogen oxide, and volatile organic carbons from our factories and motor vehicles, and creating ozone or smog, excuse me. Fog is where I live in San Francisco. Now, that smog has air pollutants in it, and air pollutants are significant for health, but also air pollutants can have a direct impact on the brain by creating some inflammatory processes. Extreme heat also begets other disasters. And in my area, none of you who read the newspaper can be sheltered from understanding how pervasive wildfires are now. And also with wildfires, the creation of more air pollutants. Wildfires, as I said, beget other disasters. Air pollution says one, and again, that has impacts on health ubiquitously, but also profound displacement of people. We're living in a world where there's a shrinkable, habitable space, and that's creating enormous pressures for what we call climate refugees. And that's a component of what's happening both from heat and wildfires. And of course, that's happening from the current extreme hurricanes that we're seeing and other disasters. This is just to remind me to tell you that the feelings that we're all having about what's happening in our world are very distressing, and we're seeing that more and more. And that these feelings, these big feelings, are not pathological. It is appropriate to feel extremely upset about what's happening in our world. Now, who is affected? Who is affected by these impacts of climate change and by extreme heat? We all are, but not equally so. And that the changes that we're seeing with climate change and with extreme heat are risk multipliers for underlying inequities in our society. That the determinants of vulnerability to extreme heat and other climate disasters are a complex mixture of variables. And I'm going to leave this, it's a complex slide. We can come back to it if we choose to. But everywhere that this is looked at scientifically finds that the most vulnerable are those who are poor and those people of color. Poverty and race are the primary issues that always are found to make people more vulnerable to these changes. And these are the populations that are most at risk for extreme heat impacts. Those who live close to the land, frail elderly, pregnant women, babies, our athletes, our children. And I do hope my grandson will be able to play outside as the world heats. Outdoor workers, our first responders, the poor, the mentally ill, and homeless. And I want to just say, the world is in our hands now. What we do matters now to how severe things will be in the future. And so CCL is about solutions. And I hope that we can take some of what I've offered you today to talk some more about the solutions so that we can make a difference. And I want to thank you for having me here today, and look forward to the discussion with you and the rest of the panelists. Thank you, and I will stop sharing.
Robin, thank you. That was an excellent talk. I really appreciate what you put into that and how you've brought us up to speed on that. The Thomas Jefferson Soil and Water Conservation District. Anne has over 25 years of land use, management, and environmental planning experience on private land, as well as with local, state, and federal agency. She's had many interesting positions in addition to her several executive director positions, to include conservation director for a 14,000-acre working cattle ranch, an EPA clean air inspector, being an EMT volunteer here in Virginia at Wintergreen and Petersburg. But the position I find most interesting is her time as a wrangler in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. We talked a little bit about that earlier, but she's had an exciting life. Anne, we'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for being here. I'm going to change course a little bit, and I know I want to be conscientious of time. We might already be running over a little bit, but I want to provide kind of a different perspective on some possible solutions. And I know the organization, you all look at policy and you think about the role of government. And so I think this is kind of a good sort of segue into what I do. I'm currently the executive director for the Thomas Jefferson Soil and Water Conservation District, which is one of the largest districts in Virginia. And we have one of the largest board of directors. Some are elected and then some are also appointed. There are 47, oh, my slide's not going forward. Hold on one sec. There we go. There are 47 districts in Virginia. And so if you don't happen to be in the area we're in, and you are in Virginia, you can always reach out to your conservation districts that do very similar things to what we do. And if you're nationwide, if you're somewhere else in the country tonight, there are over 3,000 conservation districts level. To give a little bit of a history, if you all remember the Dust Bowl, or you remember hearing about it, I hope you didn't experience it. you know that it was caused by massive amounts of over farming the land, and there was erosion and soil loss to such extremes that the federal government, in this case FDR, decided to step in and create what he called, or he asked states to enable law that would allow for soil and water conservation districts to be the receiver of federal funding. But what he really wanted, and he wanted to make sure, was that the funding that went to locations out west and throughout the country, they were, the funds were overseen and directed towards the highest priority resource concerns in the community at that time. And so instead of the federal government telling everybody in the country at the same time they needed to work on a single issue, he really wanted it to be a local decision. But it's a government agency. And so we're kind of a unique type of organization in that we're not a nonprofit. So we're not in 501c3. We are a government. We're what's called a local special district, but we also do not have the ability to raise our own funds. So we get funding from either state agencies or from grant writing, similar to a 501c3. So we have the challenges of a 501c3 from a funding perspective, but we also get to benefit from all the rules and regulations of working for a government, which can sometimes be helpful. But here in Virginia, similar to the Dust Bowl time, Virginia conservation districts decided what their priorities are. And as you all, most everybody probably on the call knows, the Chesapeake Bay and water quality is one of the highest resource concerns in the state of Virginia, as well as the Chesapeake Bay surrounding states. And so that's been the priority here, where at the time during the Dust Bowl, it was soil erosion. So hopefully that it kind of explains how we sort of came to be and what our role is and how flexible we can be, depending. Now, the Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation provides funding to districts to do what we call implement on-farm conservation practices. So since 1998, $600 million have been invested in these conservation practices on farms. Actually, 400 of that was provided by the state, and the other 200 million was provided by some other partners like our federal agencies, which I'll talk about in a second, or even by the landowners themselves, which is why we call the programs cost share. So districts, by virtue of receiving funding from the state, can provide a farmer a portion of a conservation practice. We might provide, in some cases, up to 100%, but typically it's 75, 80%, 90% sometimes, but it's just enough to have hopefully some action taken by that landowner that they otherwise would not be able to afford. They may own the land, but that doesn't mean that they've got funding to pay for some of these projects that we feel are important from a public perspective. So of course, water quality, given that we're in a Chesapeake Bay state, has been one of the #1 priorities. And it's important to note that these are voluntary efforts. As Bob mentioned, I was in the regulatory world for a good portion of my career, and I made a very distinctive change to work in an incentive program, because I do feel like working voluntarily with people in today's world, it just seems to go a lot better than the situation we're in. But one of the most exciting things I've noticed, now I was born in Virginia, raised here, and I lived in California for 20 years, and I did a lot of conservation work out there. But one of the things that was exciting when I moved back, well, even though the big hat in the room is water quality, most of the conservation practices that we facilitate farmers to investing in, we help pay for, and we help oversee and give them technical advice and engineering advice, they're actually good for climate as well. They provide carbon sequestration, and they bring really our soils into a much healthier state. So while, you know, the big hat, I call it, is clean water, it also has a co-benefit, a significant co-benefit for healthy soils. So all those millions of dollars have been tracked to document nitrogen reductions and phosphorus reductions, but they haven't been tracking how much those practices really benefit the healthy soils, and then ultimately climate. We talk about farms as working lands. You know, they do provide food, fiber, and fuel. So there's a lot of things that, well, I think we all kind of, you know, maybe we can grow some of our own vegetables. You might be brave enough to have your own chickens and eat them, or raise eggs, you know, have eggs. There's a lot of other things that the agricultural community provides, including fiber and fuel and just so many other things. And so one of the big things, of course, is that there's the potential to store carbon, or sequester carbon, if you will, long-term in our soils by implementing some of these same practices we've already been doing here for water quality. One of our big partners is the federal government, the Natural Resources Conservation Service. Now, they don't provide us typically direct funding, but they do what we call piggyback. They'll pay for a portion of a project. We might pay for a portion of it. But one of the really unique things is that they have an entire page dedicated to climate change. And I think this is an area, I provided the links at the bottom if you all want to go and look these up. But one of the areas I've worked on in California before coming back here was with a tool that they built called Comet Planner and Comet Farm. Comet Planner helps to look at a farm, work with the landowner, and help decide which types of practices they'd like to implement that have either a GHG reduction benefit or a carbon sequestration benefit. So there's a whole suite of those practices, and it's just an amazing tool. They built it with Colorado State University. It's been functioning now, I think, for 10 or 15 years. It's been, you know, revised a couple of times. It's been tested. So it's really exciting. On the left-hand side, this is a photograph of a ranch I worked on in Santa Barbara before coming back, where we were able to take compost from, it was part of a pilot project, a statewide pilot project, but we were able to take compost and apply it to rangelands. And it was through an organization called the Marin Carbon Project. It was foundation funded. This was not necessarily all government funding, but there were some folks interested at Berkeley and as well in San Francisco area to do this. And so we were able to be a recipient. We applied just a 1/4-inch dusting of compost on rangelands, and the farmer was able to increase his forage production in a single year by 16%. Well, you know, you're thinking, okay, well, that's great, but why does that matter? Well, increased forage production benefits the farmer. Of course, it's going to benefit our local food production if you're buying your food locally, but it also increases the root zones. It helps to reduce erosion. It helps to reduce runoff. So there's a lot of other benefits as well, in addition to what it provides the farmer. If you think about what could happen in Charlottesville, you know, there's compost, it's green waste, there's poultry litter that needs to be, you know, come out of the valley. There's a lot of opportunities for us to look at that here, but that was just one example of a project that I worked on. If you look at all of these practices, there are 34 of them already built into what the Comet Planner tool has. These are just some of them. They're things you're already familiar with. Tree and shrub planting, riparian forest buffer establishment. I'm sure if you're in Albemarle County, that's something you've probably heard a lot of. Everything from cover crops to mulching, and then riparian restoration alone can actually be an incredible benefit for carbon sequestration and sinking some carbon into our soils. One of the things too we'd like to think about is the water holding capacity from drought. And I know some folks have mentioned, you know, the weather patterns that have changed or are going to be changing. And the water holding capacity of our soils is going to be significant when we're talking about increased droughts, increased fires. So, you know, there's benefits for the farmers. You can think of the direct benefit of capturing carbon in the soil, but then also think about those things that can help with that changing environment, like erosion and runoff, and sequestering more and holding more water into the soils as well. NRCS, Dr. Adam Chambers has done some analysis. He looked back to 2005 and combined all of the practices that NRCS has what we call implemented or put on the ground That's the black line across the bottom shows the direct benefit when the practice was actually installed. So if you were to install 10 acres of trees, that black line shows the climate benefit, if you will, at that point in time. What the colored bars show, the green, the yellow, and the orange and the blue, show what he calls the conservation legacy effect. And so, for instance, if you think of a tree when you plant it, a contract for NRCS might be 3 years. So the benefit of that growth of the tree would be maybe the first 3 rings in the center of that tree ring. But as the tree grows, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and there's a long-lasting legacy effect. If you take the numbers from what NRCS has analyzed from 2005, all the conservation practices, and you run them through the EPA has a calculator online, you can see that the climate benefits from those agricultural practices, from programs that already exist at 82 million metric tons of CO2e, you can see how that translates to cars, gasoline vehicles off the road, et cetera. In Virginia, if you're interested in getting involved in this subject, you can go to your Soil and Water Conservation District and ask for, I think it's important to ask legislators, tell them you're interested in this, talk to your local, Board of Supervisors, but there's also what's called the Virginia Soil Health Coalition. And this group has just been recently reinvigorated, and they are really taking it full steam ahead, and they have a lot of great resources, and I'm really excited over the next couple of years to see where they take us. But I'm hoping that Virginia can start to document and recognize the climate benefits, not just from the money that we invest in our water quality, but also look at how it's a win-win for our soils as well as climate. And that's all I have. So I'm happy to answer questions if you have anything.
And that was really interesting. That's an area I've not really heard much about. So I hope everybody found it as fascinating as I did. Thank you very much for updating us on this. So we're going to go ahead and get started on our question to the panelists. So each of the panelists could activate your video and audio. I will go ahead and read a couple of the earlier received questions, and then Chris can go ahead and start presenting some of the questions that people have submitted during the presentations. So let me expand this. There we go. Okay, one of the first questions I want to ask is from Rabbi Dan Alexander, and I have to apologize for people who sent in early questions. Oftentimes there were multiple questions, but I think for the sake of time, I might just pick one of the several that you submitted. So Rabbi Dan is asking, what local efforts to reduce the effects of global warming will positively affect most immediately and impactfully the more disadvantaged members of our community? And whoever would like to start off comments, feel free to go.
A number of questions have come through with what is the single thing or what is the most important. And I think as a general overview principle, we're not at a point anymore where it's one thing that's going to do it. This is a point where there's going to be a lot of need for many different things. But Kimberly's laid out, I think, some important highlights of what are the most significant areas in communities that are most disadvantaged. And that has to do with land use and housing structure and the structure of inner cities, where many people who are disadvantaged live and experience those difficulties. So she's laid out some important ways of proceeding to protect those inner city areas. And one is green spaces and planting trees. Now, trees take a while to grow. And as Bob has also said, another major impact is pollutants for communities of color, and Kimberly's spoken about how that has a history to it. So anything that reduces air pollutants and cleans up the environment from refineries and factories and freeway and transportation has a very important immediate impact on the communities that are most impacted, and differentially so.
Thank you, Robin. Okay, let me move on to our next question here. And I'm not sure who this came from, but I think it was a couple who said they have an idea to encourage Virginians to share and witness their own experiences on climate change. And they started on a website called howdoyouseeit.org. So said, will you be identifying locations that have been impacted? So I assume that means in Virginia where climate change has had an impact. And I thought about that a little bit. I'll let you chip in as well here. Certainly when I talked about the spread of Lyme disease ticks in Virginia, that's been pretty dramatic over a 20-year stretch. We all know about sea level rise, its impact on Norfolk, the naval station there. Some things I saw said that the level of rise in the mid-Atlantic coast is 3 times the global average. So that's a very significant impact of climate change. And I'll allow our panelists to add any others that you can think about for the Commonwealth.
I want to just jump in because I feel somehow that with a laser focus on heat and humans, I feel like we've forgotten that actually the heat is so important, partly because of the way it affects us, but also because it changes the dynamics of everything that happens on the planet in terms of the natural systems that support us. So Robin mentioned the hurricane, a hot ocean. You think that you don't care about a hot ocean because it's far out there. You're not on the ocean, but the hot ocean fuels these storms. And a hot atmosphere, you think, well, I don't care if it's hot up there, but you do, because the hot atmosphere holds more water. So every time it rains, the rainstorms are heavier. We have had deaths here in Albemarle County. We have had flooding it's crazy. Flooding is crazy. And it's because we have different kinds of rain patterns because of the heat. So it's funny, we're focusing on heat. It's very direct and we all understand it. We can relate to it. But there are so many indirect effects. To that question, what impacts have we felt in Virginia? You have felt them pretty much every summer with different kinds of temperature regimes, and you feel them every time it rains because that rainstorm is probably stronger than it should have been.
Deborah, you have done an extremely beautiful job of talking about how these are so interconnected. And although when we speak about something, we can only speak one at a time, these are so interconnected, and extracting them as if they stand alone is an impossibility. So I thank you for that.
Next question I got from, I think the name was Cindy. The one that I picked of her 3 is, I understand that heat being accumulated in the oceans is as dangerous and damaging as heat in the air, perhaps more so. Could you comment? Well, I went ahead and just went to a site on NOAA, climate.gov, and just some of their bullet points. More than 90% of the warming that happened on Earth between 1971 and 2010 occurred in the ocean. Averaged over we'll skip that one. Increasing ocean heat content is contributing to sea level rise, ocean heat waves and coral bleaching, melting of ocean terminating glaciers and ice sheets around Greenland and Antarctica. And heat already stored in the ocean will eventually be released into the environment. So
I think I just want to, as the scientist here, pile on that last point, that the heat in the ocean is just kind of, that's where it's absorbed, but it's going to come out. So I guess I would just say it's a lag. There's a lag that we have because of the ocean. So the ocean takes in a ton of heat and we sort of thank the ocean for that, but yet it's going to come back. Like it doesn't just disappear down into some depth. It's going to come back.
Might be hard to select what is worse, oceans versus the air, but after these statistics, I'm starting to feel like the oceans might be the winner.
Well, we don't live in the ocean, so I guess we tend to focus on what's happening on the land surface. But yeah, it's certainly going to affect us all.
But large numbers of populations around the world depend on what
Fish.
the ocean brings for food and nutrition.
Absolutely.
Kimberly, I have two of your students who wrote in questions. Allegra Stewart, with the money and power behind the oil and gas industry's ability to promote their agenda, how do grassroots environmental movements best communicate the immediate need to act on climate change? Kimberly, I'm not saying you have to answer this one. We can throw this out for anybody, but I think, as Robin and I have experienced being members of CCL, I'm also with Virginia Clinicians for Climate Action. I think what you have to do is get out and advocate, sell the issue, sell the message, talk to people, take any opportunity you can to let people know about this threat. Panel?
I think that we've also seen the effectiveness of political organizing. So direct action is great for rallying support and bringing attention, as Professor Fields said. I think you also have to combine that with political organizing, because ultimately we have to hold our legislators and at state and national levels accountable for the actions they're taking.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. I think I'll go ahead and ask Chris, Mr. Ask Me. I assume you've gotten some questions from the viewers today?
Yes, Bob. Let me share one that has to do with the urgency of the problem. One person, I'm paraphrasing it, and also Deborah Lawrence sort of explained this, that global heating's impacts are not really incremental, but more like a situation where if you step up, the next category is many times worse in terms of damage. But humans, they'll go outside on a hot day and they'll say, well, 1 degree of temperature rise, I don't even feel that. So how can we help people understand that it isn't incremental, that it's much more steep of a curve? Yes, Robin.
I open the newspaper. This summer has been a lesson in, we are already feeling it. And Bob and I might have started at CCL years ago when we were kind of thinking this was going to happen in the future. This wasn't going to be like right now. It's now. What's happening in the Sierras with the wildfires now? The newspaper reported this morning that the behavior of the wildfires is like nothing that has ever been seen before. There have never been wildfires where the fire has gone over the crest of the Sierras on both sides. That's never happened. Louisiana, this week, Hurricane Ida was a storm that was far worse than what we have ever seen. And those are just this week. This summer has been relentless over and over and over. We just have to keep saying it is now. And what we're seeing is telling us we have to fight off what I think is compassion fatigue, where we just can't listen anymore.
I want to just add an additional, those are great examples of urgent, dramatic events that really we can begin to attribute to climate change. Like, there's not supposed to happen. This is Zoom land, and I'm hearing my children do the dishes. They're a little loud. Sorry about that. Thank goodness they're doing the dishes. But another perspective I want to bring is that in terms of these numbers, like 1 degree of warming, 2 degrees of warming, that sounds so like nothing. The frame of reference could be that what have we seen in the past? And I'll just tell you that in the past several hundred years, we have never seen more variation than about a 0.5 degree warmer or cooler. And we are right now 1 degree warmer. So what does that mean? That means we have twice the variation that we've ever seen. We are seeing something that's double what the world has seen. So to me, I guess I'm a kind of a mathy, sciencey person, but the idea that we are doing something that's twice as big as something that's ever been done, that matters. And that we would add another 0.5 degree, that's like 3 times as much. And then to 2 degrees, that's 4 times what we've seen in what we think of as our history of civilization. So the numbers are not very helpful. It's why it's nice to think about things that happen locally. But if you do want to think about the global scale, this is the truth. We have never seen anything like this. This 0.5 degree is what we're used to in civilization. And we've already got 1, and we're looking at, something that's 4 times what we've ever experienced. That's different. 4 times is different than just 1 degree warmer.
And it's everywhere in the world.
Sobering. Chris, got another one?
Okay, one having to do with political activity. One writer says, with COP26 later this year, how important is it for everyone concerned about climate change and loss of biodiversity to contact their political representatives? And then he comments, politicians will only take account of what we think if we demand action from them.
I think the answer is extremely critical. I mean, you have to make your voice known, make your interest known. If you look what's happening now, and Robin alluded to the number of years you've been with CCL, it's interesting in terms of how many national legislators are actually working with particular climate change, carbon type of, carbon regulation type of legislation, where this was never thought of in the past. So it's been a very slow evolution, but we're actually in a pretty good place now. We're keeping our fingers crossed. And, with CCL, we have a calling campaign, a monthly calling campaign, and we call our elected representatives every month to tell them what we think about in terms of particular pieces of legislation, usually having to do with the price on carbon. But everybody should do that. I mean, if you're truly, sincerely concerned about this, you need to let your elected officials know. If enough people tell them that this is a problem, they may actually do something about it. Robin.
Also, can I just add that the framework that we're dealing with at the United Nations right now is one of national pledges and national responsibility and national legislation. So if you're interested in the international agreement, you need to be pushing your legislators to adopt national actions, just like what Robin and Bob are talking about. So our national commitment is what you want to push if you want to see success at the United Nations.
Deborah, beautiful, because I want to follow on what you're saying. Yes, it has to be national. And this question was about the COP26 meetings in November that are international. And we cannot afford to have President Biden go there empty-handed. He has to be able to bring something to the international community that commits the United States to leadership here. He will not be able to bring the international community together. And what's being voted on now is the reconciliation bills that are in the Senate now. Those have to pass. That's where the bulk of legislation on climate is being worked at now. So we have to be on the backs of our legislators. And of course, then also for CCL, the incredible tool that pricing carbon has in impacting the way emissions will be in the future. So yes, political activity at the national level is essential, but it has to be now so that Biden can go to those meetings with something in hand.
Excellent, thank you. Well, this has actually been quite stimulating, very interesting. I appreciate everybody's contributions here. Recognizing that this meeting was to last until 8 o'clock and that Emily Irvin does have some closing remarks, I will go ahead and turn it over to her. I'm happy to stick around a little bit afterwards if anybody else is on the panel is able to, if we want to address any additional questions, if any of our audience want to stay around as well. So Emily, are you ready to make your closing remarks here?
I am. Thank you, Bob. I just wanted to thank everyone again. I hope that everyone here tonight found the discussion as interesting and informative and sobering as I did. And I hope you all feel called to act. This summer, we have seen major heat-related natural disasters everywhere all over this country, and it would take us all evening to list the international disasters that have happened as well. You know, the fires in California and the Pacific Northwest, and drought across the West, and of course, Hurricane Ida along the Gulf Coast, and it's headed here for us this evening. We know that from all of our presenters that heat affects us in more insidious ways too, by exacerbating inequality and degrading our drinking water and harming our physical and mental health, just to name a few. And so I think we all are feeling that if there's ever a time to get involved or to get more involved, the time is now. So we ask you to please call your member of Congress and ask them to boldly address climate change in the reconciliation package. We ask you to go out and talk to your friends and your family and your colleagues about climate change and encourage them to get involved too. We invite you to join Citizens Climate Lobby if you're interested in that. We'll have links and information about that in the chat and in a follow-up email. And I'm going to end the evening by sharing a quote from a climate activist and journalist, Emily Atkin. She says, "However worse the climate crisis gets now depends on how quickly society transforms. And how quickly society transforms depends on how many people demand it. The most harmful lie being spread about climate change today is not that it's fake. It's that nothing you can do can help save the world." So please, we invite you to get involved. And thank you so much for being here with us tonight.